Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher from Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Hello everyone and welcome to Fish University. Now I know a lot of our listeners are probably avid anglers and most of you likely target bass. As an angler, you've probably caught largemouth bass and you've probably caught smallmouth bass. You may even have recognized it when you caught a spotted bass. But did you know there are quite a few more species out there? In fact, you may have caught a different species and not even realized it. To discuss the diversity of black bass species, I've invited Steve Sammons from Auburn University. Steve is a research fellow at Auburn and has conducted research on both the more common species and the more unique species of bass. Hey, Steve, how are you doing today?
I am doing well. I appreciate you having me.
Well, welcome to Fish University. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, maybe how you got into fisheries research, and specifically your interest in bass and black bass in particular?
Sure. I grew up in South Jersey, near Philadelphia. I started fishing at a young age, mostly in lakes. As I got older, I really got into fishing, and my folks camped a lot, and I was always outdoors. So when it came time to try to choose what I was going to go to college for, I had never heard of fisheries. New Jersey has a pretty small fish agency. I think they only have two offices, one in the south and one in the north. And what I knew about fish management, if you will, is stocking trout, which they do for basically not even delayed harvest. It's just put and take in some of those lakes. So I didn't know about that. So when I was looking for what to do, I found forestry. And I was like, well, that sounds cool. I like woods, and we camped in the woods and all that. And so I ended up at Virginia Tech working on forestry. And I probably wasn't in that program more than a year and a half when I started running into these fisheries people. And I'm like, wait, what? That's an option? So I double majored for a little while in both fisheries and forestry. And then when I realized that a lot of forestry is basically cutting down trees for profit, I decided that really wasn't for me and switched over to fisheries full time. From there, I went to South Dakota State for my master's. I worked 5 years at Tennessee Tech University, directed several large research projects there. And then I ended up down here at Auburn for my PhD. And one thing led to another, and I just never left. I've been very lucky to have worked on a lot of things. I've worked in streams, rivers, natural lakes, reservoirs, and small impoundments over the years. I'm approaching literally 30 years past my master's degree, so I kind of consider that like the beginning of my full-time career. So I've been around and seen and done a lot. I've gotten into this native black bass stuff more recently, and that has opened a lot of new opportunities for me. I haven't counted up really how many species of bass I've officially worked on, but it's at least 10.
And you used the term black bass, and we've said bass a few times, but in reality, what we're talking about here is not even a bass. Is that correct?
Right. So what we call in North America bass in freshwater are actually a part of the sunfish family. So sunfish are what we think of when we think of bluegill and all that, but it also is crappies, and it's all of the bass species that are in the inland waters. And there's also some smaller species of sunfish, that some of which only get like 2 or 3 inches, that are still part of that same family. And that whole family is native only to North America.
Certainly. And when we talk about the true bass, we're talking about temperate bass, things like striped bass, white perch.
Right. Yeah. And then you have a bunch of sea basses.
I'm still trying to figure out why we call bluegill brims. So you
Right, right, exactly.
Black bass are in the sunfish family. They're related to bluegill. They're related to crappie. They don't look like a bluegill or a crappie. They tend to be much more elongate, more football shaped, if you will, typically a lot thicker across the sides, usually larger mouths. They tend to be predators. They tend to be at the top of the food chain. So they do look a lot more like a temperate bass, like a striped bass, for example. Now, the purpose of this particular episode today is that we're talking about the fact that there's so many more species of black bass than even I realized when I got into this field.
Oh, sure.
And so we're not talking about just two species or three species of black bass anymore, right? We're actually talking about many, and we'll get into that in a minute. But before we do that, let's talk exactly about how we define a species. How do we define that two bass that look similar to the average person are different? I know traditionally we did that through the way they looked, using the body shape, the body form, the colors, the meristic counts, which are counts of scales, counts of fin rays. But nowadays we're a lot more technologically advanced and we get genetics into the mix, right?
Right. So I'm not a systematic ichthyologist by any stretch of the imagination, so some of them will probably throw a brick at me when they see what I'm saying here. But traditionally, fish have been described at the species level, based, like you said, on colors and meristic counts and all that, but also on distributions. And back in the 30s and 40s, there were a couple of really sharp gentlemen with the last names of Bailey and Hubbs who wandered all around the southeastern United States, picking up fish and just looking at them, essentially. This was before the days of genetics, obviously, and seeing where they came from, where they didn't come from, and started getting some idea of, hey, there's not just largemouth and smallmouth bass and maybe spotted bass. They based a lot of that stuff on certainly appearance, but also on river basin. For instance, the fish that we now know as shoal bass were only found in the Apalachicola River Basin and nowhere else. And what they did do, because they were limited by their technology, they literally circled some areas on the map and said, well, we think something's going on here. They might be different, might need to be revisited in the future. And some of the species that we now have described or are in the process of being described are literally ones that these two guys circled on a map in 1940 and said, hey, something's going on here. We just don't know for sure what it is. And so now with all this, with these genetic techniques that we have, and it's not really the techniques, because let's face it, the techniques have been around for 40 years in some form or fashion. It's the speed and efficiency that we now have that has made these samples, first of all, you can do high volumes because you can do them faster. You can also do them cheaper. Basically, what has happened in the last 20 to 25 years is genetics have come down to the bottom shelf where a lot of folks can use them now. And a lot of states and state agencies now have their own genetic labs. And that has been a game changer. It used to take weeks to run these samples. It used to take a lot of equipment to run these samples. It used to require a lot of material to run these samples. And now we're down to the point of being able to identify a fish genetically with, a fingernail size chunk of fin. And it can take 5 days tops to analyze a sample completely. And that's not literal, like it takes them to do 5 days, but they usually do them in batches of 100 or 150 at a time. So it might take them that long to accumulate them all into the tray that they run. That has been the real game changer. That has allowed us to use genetics in a much more comprehensive and quick way over a wider geographical area. And that has really enhanced our ability to look at cryptic biodiversity, which is basically species that are actually genetically different but look a lot alike. That's kind of a quick and dirty rundown of how species identification seems to be going on now in the 21st century.
I remember when I was early in college, species was defined as two distinct organisms that were not able to breed, but that's not even remotely correct. We see hybridization of fish species all the time. It doesn't mean they can't reproduce because they're close enough related that they can. It's just that they choose not to, or they don't under normal circumstances without a lot of environmental conditions that are right. It's a rare thing in nature unless the nature has been disturbed in some way.
Yeah, compared to other vertebrates, fish have a very weak reproductive isolation. It's just that simple. Not only can they breed together, when they do, most of their progeny are still viable. This is not like a mule situation. Fish are really different than a lot of terrestrial vertebrates.
With all of that said, we're here today to talk about the fact that there's so many species of bass. We've been moving towards more and more black bass species for a while, but a paper came out recently that looked at all the species, their genetics, their geographic distributions, and they decided that we have at least 14 species of fish, possibly 5 or 6 more. The paper I'm talking about is in Scientific Reports. It's the Kim, Taylor, and Neer paper.
Mm-hmm.
And with that paper, I mean, a lot of the species I grew up fishing, and I know you grew up fishing, either their names have changed or they're split into multiple species. So let's talk about a lot of the different species that we have in black bass, where they live, how they're different, anything unique about their life histories. And I think we should start off with largemouth bass. If you followed largemouth bass for years, you've known it as Micropterus salmoides as the scientific name. You're probably aware that there's a Florida version of it. Well, now they're separate species. And the Florida bass retained the Micropterus salmoides.
Yeah, that's the proposal. When people name fish, or name anything, should I say, there is usually the very first specimen that was ever taken of that animal, and that's the one that they've named it off of. Pretty sure that's called the holotype. And that type specimen for the bass was collected near Charleston, South Carolina. And so the proposal out right now is that fish was actually a Florida bass. And so therefore, because that was named salmoides, Florida bass should be salmoides. However, of course, we don't have the specimen, so we're not sure that that's true, but they're going based on genetics done in Georgia and in North Carolina, but not South Carolina. South Carolina has not actually, they're in the process right now of doing that. Now, honestly, some of the stuff I've seen in Georgia would suggest that fish would have been a natural hybrid between the two. So then I'm not sure what that does, to the actual thing. But yeah, it's still in flux right now. The one thing we are sure about is that there are 2 fish that had been called largemouth bass. Like you mentioned, there's the Florida version and what used to be called the northern version. And so the Florida version was thought to be restricted to the peninsula of Florida, really the southern half of the peninsula of Florida. But more recent genetic work has shown that you can get pure specimens of them up the eastern seaboard, at least to South Carolina. Georgia has done a very concentrated look at their largemouth bass, and they have basically a northwest to southeast gradient of Florida bass genes. The farther southeast you go in that state, the more and more Florida bass genes you get in these fish, until you get basically in the southeast corner of the state, they're basically pure Florida bass. And South Carolina has yet to do something like that. They're in the process of doing it. That is one of those states that has their own genetic lab. So the state itself is doing all of that. And so it takes a little longer than Georgia was using, actually, the facility we had here at Auburn University that was set up to do large volume of samples, and they only did bass. Florida, South Carolina, 2 states that have their own genetics programs, they don't have the luxury of saying, we're just going to do bass. So we're waiting to see what actually happens there. But so largemouth bass, irrespective of the Florida influence, they're the most widely distributed bass in North America, native. What a lot of folks don't realize is how restricted in terms of continental largemouth bass original native range was. So they're actually native to the Mississippi River Basin, and to the Mobile Basin, over to the southern Atlantic part. And basically, they think their native range was somewhere in the North Carolina, and that was it. So all the fish I grew up fishing in New Jersey and through the northeastern part of this country had been stocked. They've been there for 150, 200 years. So they're not actually native there. And everything to the west is all stocked. So originally they had a much smaller range than they have now. Of course, largemouth bass now are found completely through the United States, through an awful lot of Canada, all over Mexico, and then worldwide. In just about, I think they're on every continent now except Antarctica. And they're in every U.S. state except Alaska. So they're very, very widespread. Smallmouth bass is the next most widely. A lot of the black bass species have a very similar native range. The big ones, the three big ones, the spotted bass, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's all the Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes. That's the weird thing is that they're in the Great Lakes, but they're not in the rest of the Northeast. So their native range actually goes up the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is the border between Canada and the United States. And so smallmouth bass are also in the Mississippi River Basin. They're in the northern half of the Mississippi River Basin. I've heard thoughts that they might not have been native to most of the Missouri River Basin. For what reason, I'm not 100% sure. And then spotted bass are like the exact opposite. And we'll probably deal with them in more detail in a second. But the original spotted bass is on the lower half of the Mississippi River Basin is where they were, up through like the Ohio River Basin, but not up in Minnesota and Wisconsin and those kinds of places. So those are the big three, if you will. Those are the ones that have the biggest range by far. Once you get below those three, it starts getting a whole lot more regional and to some degree river by river kind of a thing.
Yeah, and those are the three that people are most familiar with, not only because they're the most widely distributed, but because a lot of the other species that we deal with seem to be similar in relationship to one of those species. Like, now the Florida bass and the largemouth bass are sort of a split off of the same general ancestor, which, by the way, we mentioned that the Florida bass retained the name Micropterus salmoides. The new name for largemouth bass is, am I saying this right, Micropterus nigricans?
Nigricans, I think, is what I heard, yeah.
It's interesting. A paper, I don't know, what was it, 15 or 20 years ago, proposed to split the two species up, and it never caught on.
Right.
But this new paper came out, and almost immediately, the American Fisheries Society's new Common and Scientific Names of Fishes book switched to the new nomenclature.
Interesting.
So we're talked a little bit about the largemouth bass. You mentioned smallmouth bass. We've already split the smallmouth bass now into several species. I didn't know this. I started hearing talk of something called a Neosho bass, and apparently two of the additional possible species might be split out of smallmouth as well. So the smallmouth bass might suddenly become 4 species down the road.
So Neosho smallmouth bass were one of the critters that Hubbs and Bailey had highlighted as something possibly different. That's one of the ones where their distribution is very different. It's distinct, I should say. They're native to the Ozarks in southwestern Missouri and southeast Oklahoma. And I think that, they do go a little bit into Arkansas. Not too much, but just a little bit. And so that's a distinct, my geography there is not great. I can't remember the name of the river system that would be, but it's part of the Arkansas River system, I believe, but it's not like the White River system in Arkansas, which is the other species, the more widespread cosmopolitan species. So my colleague here at Auburn, Shannon Brewer, has done a ton of work on Ozark smallmouth bass. She did for a PhD. When she was at Oklahoma State University, she pretty much had an ongoing research project of some form or shape the entire time she was there on these Neosho bass. You always like it when you have some biological differences that can at least make you say, okay, different fish. Well, Neosho bass do not live in lakes or reservoirs. And Oklahoma Game and Fish, OWC, they noticed that when those rivers were impounded, the smallmouth bass disappeared. they actually ended up stocking them in some of those reservoirs. They would stock the fish, and they stocked what everyone calls the Tennessee strain of smallmouth bass, which is just your regular old smallmouth bass, and they do fine in lakes. And then they realized that these fish were actually quite different. At first, they just thought the fish just didn't take when they dammed the reservoir up and weren't going to move into the reservoir on their own, just because I don't think we appreciated how much fish move back then. And so their solution was, well, we're just going to do this. And so there's smallmouth bass fisheries in a lot of those reservoirs now, but they're not the native ones. But some of the work Shannon's done with some radio telemetry has really been interesting. It's a little more arid over there, and so their reservoirs actually go down to the point where the rivers get extended. And she was doing a radio telemetry study during one of those scenarios. And when the reservoir went down and the river became 10 miles longer, some of her fish moved down into the river. And as soon as the reservoir came back up, when the rains returned, they went right back up the river. And I was like, wow. I mean, this is basically a lotic species of bass, which is very similar to a lot of the other ones we're going to talk about. So this one's totally different than the smallmouth bass that we all think about, even though they don't look that much different. And I have never seen one in person, but the pictures I see, they don't look a lot different, honestly, than the other ones, but they act completely different, and they're genetically different, distinct, and I think there's some counts that are somewhat different, which is what made Hubbs and Bailey say this is, they had a subspecies, is what they had called it. And then the other one is the Ouachita smallmouth bass, and even less is known about that. It's another one that I think had been victimized by rampant stocking of the other kind without us realizing that that was different. I do know that Arkansas Game and Fish has done some work to try to find these things and find pure specimens, and they have found some, but unlike the Neoshos, these guys are certainly a conservation risk, and they don't live in very accessible areas. They're very hard to get to, from what I've been told, and so that just makes it harder to know exactly what's going on with them. But they are also genetically distinct, and I think they were kind of sort of recognized as probably a subspecies of the fish prior to this new classification. But that's about all we know. The genetics are different. I don't remember if there's any kind of morphological differences there. But again, that river systems that they're found in is also distinct from the northern smallmouth bass, the original one, the big one, and the Neoshos. So they all live in places where they can't mix. And that's one of the things that creates species in the first place, is geographic isolation. So that area there of, northwest Arkansas, southeast Oklahoma, and southwest Missouri is quite a diversity hotspot for smallmouth bass. And I don't think that's nearly been resolved, other than the Osho fish, which is pretty much a slam dunk. The other two are just not known enough about yet to really make a determination. But that's what Hubbs and Bailey said about a lot of other fish 80 years ago that now are separate species. So it's just probably waiting for the future.
So just a quick question, a follow-up on the Neosho bass. You mentioned that when they built the reservoirs, it excluded the Neoshos. They brought in the smallmouth bass. Has there been a lot of research to look at whether or not those smallmouth bass are invading up the rivers and impacting the Neoshos?
Yeah, they are in some cases, and I don't want to go too far into that because that's more of a Shannon thing. But I do know in some streams that's a problem. And they've done genetic work, and they've found hybrids between the two of them. And there's other streams that it doesn't seem to be as much of a problem. Some of them they probably didn't stock. I didn't stock all the reservoirs. I know that much. There was some that they stocked, but that's about all I know. But fortunately, I do know there are entire streams and rivers where there are no smallmouth bass, and that's a pretty rural part of the world. So outside of water withdrawals for, irrigation or whatever, and like I said, it is arid, so you have that risk. They're doing well enough compared to some of these other species. Yeah, they're a super cool animal. I would love to get over there and actually fish for them and see a couple of them.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's W-E-S, .Neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's M-S-S-T-A-T-E, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show. Let's talk about the other one of the big three, the spotted bass.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up, I think I called a spotted bass. I want to say we called it a Kentucky bass, but a spotted bass, very common fish if you fish the Tennessee River, the Ohio River, that area. But now we have the Alabama bass, which to me was a spotted bass as well. I might be incorrect here, but doesn't the Guadalupe bass, isn't it more closely related to the spotted bass than the other bass species?
Well, I'll tell you, I have learned this much, being a non-geneticist and I'm pretty much a non-taxonomist either. When it comes to who's related more to who, boy, it depends on who you ask and what model gets run, and you can get into like fist fights. So I'm not going to go there, but I do like to group these critters in my head anyway as the brown fish and the spotted bass like looking fish, and certainly Guadalupe bass look a lot. They're in the spotted bass group in that when you look at them, if you had never seen one, didn't know where it came from, you would think, maybe it's a spotted bass. The spotted bass story is kind of an interesting story, so originally, like you said, you had the one species of spotted bass, and it was found in the Ohio River drainage and the Mississippi River drainage in Tennessee, all through the Tennessee drainage, and the Arkansas River and the White River, and some of I think the lower part of the Missouri River, because I know Kansas has them and stuff like that. And then it also was found down on the Gulf Coast, along a lot of those rivers west of the Apalachicola. And that included the Mobile Basin. Now, that's another one where Hubbs and Bailey had come in and they considered the ones in the Mobile Basin to be a subspecies. And so it was the Alabama spotted bass and the northern spotted bass, which a lot of folks, like you said, called them the Kentucky spots, which I've never figured out why. And I only say that because certainly the ones in Kentucky are spotted bass, but so are the ones in Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, and I could go on, Tennessee and all of those. And I'm like, why did it not become the Tennessee bass or the Missouri bass? Who knows? But so they had considered them at the subspecies level based on meristic counts and stuff like that. The funny thing is that I had a unique perspective on these two fish, still being a non-taxonomist, but just someone who worked on bass. Because I worked for 5 years in Tennessee, like I mentioned, and I worked with spotted bass along with largemouth and smallmouth. I saw lots of them. I always heard of this Alabama spotted bass, and I just figured they were really close. Like you can't tell a largemouth bass and a Florida bass in your hand at all. They look 100% the same, and so I'm thinking it was going to be one of those situations. And then I came down here, and I went fishing over right just to the west of here in the Tallapoosa River, caught my first Alabama spotted bass, and I'm like, what is this? Because that doesn't look anything like that. For one thing, it's somewhat brown. When you're up in Tennessee, if you're looking at the spotted bass, you're saying, is that a largemouth or not? You're never pulling out an Alabama spotted bass saying, gee, I wonder if that's a largemouth. I mean, it's just totally a different color. And then when you dig into it a little more, you realize that, okay, Alabama bass grow as fast as largemouth bass. They reach 9-10 pounds, and the other one rarely reaches 3. And, like in Tennessee, a 16-inch spotted bass was 8 or 9 years old and the end of its life. And it's like, okay, there's no way in heck these things are the same species or even subspecies. I mean, come on. One gets 22 inches and the other one gets 16. a professor here, as a matter of fact, that went ahead and formally described the species as separate. And so the Alabama bass is what the old Alabama spotted bass used to be. Its native range is just the Mobile River Basin, which is almost all of Alabama except for this part up at the very top, which is Tennessee and Southeast. We'll get to that in just a second. And then a little slice of Georgia and a little tiny slice of Tennessee. And of course, Mississippi has some too along the eastern border there. And they've been stocked outside their range all the way to California. I think Texas has one reservoir that has them in it as well. The ones in California learn how to eat trout, and they're the ones that get 9, 10, 11 pounds. I mean, the world record used to be almost 9 pounds, and it was from here in Alabama. And then once those fish in California learn how to eat trout, they destroyed that record. And I think the current one is almost 12. So they are a very different animal than spotted bass in terms of size. I mean, I'm sure their ecology is probably very similar, like smallmouth bass, like largemouth bass, like spotted bass. Alabama bass live in rivers, streams, reservoirs, wherever you put them for the most part. They're not a big fan of ponds, I don't think, as much as but they're very adaptive. And that is the hallmark of those 3 fish, or 4, counting Alabama bass. That's the hallmark of them, and that's what separates them from almost all of the other bass, is that they live in lakes, reservoirs, rivers, streams. They handle a lot of different kinds of habitat. Once you get away from those 4 species, that their habitat niche really starts shrinking. And that's what makes those other bass species so interesting, because we used to just consider bass as a group to be this cosmopolitan species that eats all the other fish and can handle anything. They're bulletproof. You know, build a factory on my reservoir, I don't care. Have a pig farm upstream, I don't care. You know, low DO, I'm good. High temperatures, I'm still good. I can eat bugs, I can eat shad, I can eat crayfish, I can eat sunfish, I'm happy, I don't care. Well, now we've realized that that's only true for them. After you get below them, it starts to get a lot more interesting. And I guess while we're on spotted bass, I might as well bring a species up that's still not formally described yet. But I love this one because it's one that Hubbs and Bailey circled on the map in 1940 and said, we think something weird's going on here and it needs to be examined. And so if you have a map of the United States and you see where the Mobile Basin is and you see where the Apalachicola system is, and you say, okay, fish that look like spotted bass are found all throughout the rivers from the Apalachicola system, not in it, but from there all the way over to Texas. But here's the thing, if you look at that big thing and then highlight the Mobile Basin, you realize that there's a huge basin of non-spotted bass that cuts off that whole corner of southeast Alabama from all the rest of them. And it's been that way forever, which is why Hubbs and Bailey circled that and said, we think something's going on here because these fish have been isolated for 100,000 years or more. What I love about sometimes with fish IDs, there's people that love to identify species. That's their thing. What I love is when someone finds a species that they're not looking for. And so we were working on shoal bass. There was a bunch of us working on shoal bass, and Florida was looking at their once population in the Chipola River, and they were getting these hybrids, and they were with Guadalupe bass, which is from, the hill country in Texas. And I remember it was so funny. So there was a group of us that try to meet every couple of years, and we talk about all our issues, and so here's a group of biologists from 5 states sitting there in this room trying to come up with some crazy way that Guadalupe bass ended up in the Chipola River in Florida. They're talking about black helicopters and government trains in the 1800s and all these quite crazy theories. And it probably wasn't even a year after that meeting that they were like, well, we ought to go look and just see what's in the streams to the west of here and get their genetics, see if there's any weird hybrids over there. So they went to, Choctawhatchee is the very next river over there. They went to the Choctawhatchee River, collected a bunch of spotted bass, ran the genetics on them, and their genetics were nothing like spotted bass. They were actually looked like Guadalupe bass genetically. And they're like, oh my God, this is a different species of fish. And so it has not been formally described yet, but they're in the process of it, and they call it the Choctaw bass. And its type locality is the Choctaw-Hatchie River. And they look a lot like spotted bass, but there are some differences, scale counts and stuff like that. They also only seem to be found in rivers. They're not something that likes reservoirs. And they're a cool critter. They're down on the coast. They're in these low gradient but still rocky, like limestoney streams. Very little is known about them. They only seem to get about 2.5 pounds too. But so that's another species that's one of those ones it's got historical context in that it was identified, but wasn't, until literally like 2010, 11, 12, something like that, when somebody just decided to run genetics and go, oh my God, that fish was a hybrid with someone who threw the Choctaw bass in from the very next river system over. We blindly grope our way sometimes. My old advisor, John Ney, he used to have this lovely catchphrase that I use all the time now: science stumbles on. And that's exactly, sometimes we just stumble into stuff. And so that's one of the species that we literally stumbled into.
So, and coming from Auburn and working in the Auburn area, you're kind of in the hot spot, I think, for bass diversity.
Oh yeah. I tell people all the time that if they want to come here and do an incredible bass slam, there's about 12 species of bass in a 2-hour radius drive from here.
Let's talk about some of those other species. You mentioned the shoal bass. Let's talk about it.
Sure. Yeah. So shoal bass are what I've worked on the most. It is a fish found only in the Apalachicola River Basin. That is the Chattahoochee and the Flint River. And like I said, the Chipola River in Florida, which is a tributary of the Apalachicola River. They are lotic specialists. They are found only in flowing water. If you put up a reservoir, they disappear. And unlike most of the others that we're going to talk about, this is a big river fish. So it's not found in really small, wadeable streams. It likes like 4th order or bigger, and probably more like 5th order streams. I always tell people, if you can get a canoe down it in the summer when the water's low, that's big enough for a shoal bass. They grow like a largemouth bass and actually outgrow largemouth bass in the Flint River. They grow faster than them. They routinely reach 5 to 6 pounds. They are an absolute hoot to fish for. Their ecology is very much like a large river sucker, like a lot of the ones out west. They swim incredible distances to spawn, and they aggregate in these big shoal complexes. We had fish move as much as 200 kilometers to reach some of these places. Their dispersal ability is amazing. I had a radio telemetry project on a stream nearby here in Georgia, where there's a series of waterfalls that drop about 70 feet. The first drop is at least 15 to 20. And we had a radio tag fish go over that and come back up it twice, just to prove that the first time wasn't a fluke. But they go over stuff that you go, how did they get over that? They are doing stuff that bass don't typically do. So they're a really neat fish, very popular to angle for, as you might suspect, with that size. I call them the ultimate river fish if I'm an angler. I call them the ultimate river bass, should I say. And the only reason I say that is that because of their growth potential, they reach 5 pounds way quicker and more commonly than smallmouth bass, which is my other absolute favorite river fish, But I mean, gosh, if you know what you're doing, if you are, you don't have to be super expert, but I mean, as long as you kind of done it before and you're somewhat competent, you expect in the spring to catch a 5-pound fish almost every outing. If you find some of those spawning aggregations, I mean, it's like fishing in a Canadian Shield Lake. I had a friend who caught like 75 in a single afternoon this past spring, just finding one of those areas, and they were just piled in there. So they're a really cool fish, because of their, and this is true of all these other fish we're going to talk about, because of their limited range the fact that they don't like reservoirs. They are somewhat impearled. You mentioned hybridization. One of the ways that fish do start hybridizing is when you take a fish that's not supposed to be there, a bass, and move it there. That's when the hybridization happens. And it's very similar to what happened out west with the cutthroat trout when we stocked rainbows all over the place. Well, that's happened in some of these places. The Chattahoochee River in particular is just a genetic pit. It really is. There's 6 species of bass in there, and only 3 of them are native. And so there's all kinds of funky hybridization going on there. And it's a major concern. What the shoal bass used to be considered was a red-eye bass. And it's another one of those ones where it's like everyone knew it wasn't a red-eye bass, but that's what it had been classified as until 1999 when it was split apart. And it's sort of like the Alabama bass, northern spotted bass. I think a lot of people did not think they were the same species. But red-eye bass are another really neat fish. They are like the polar opposites, if you will, of shoal bass in terms of what kind of size streams they like. They are headwater specialists. They are also a fish, for the most part, that does not handle impoundment, even small impoundments, like a small city drinking impoundment that maybe just a wide spot in the river, with regular flow. They're not going to be in there. They just totally aren't there. But they like little streams. The smaller the stream, the better they seem to do, or at least the more dominant they seem to be. So there are some really, really small streams. We sampled a stream here in town that goes through a park. I mean, it's so small that you would never be able to cast a line there. You'd like just drop it off the bank. It's like 20 feet wide. And I think we collected 25 or 30 red-eye bass from that stream, and not another other kind of bass. And that seems to be their strategy, is that we will like stuff so small, none of the other bass like that. And that's going to be our stronghold. Not a lot is known about this fish. We think they're probably insect eaters more than fish eaters. They only get about 10 inches, 12 inches, a really big fish. And that's another fish that has been recently broken up into a lot of other species. As originally described by, again, Hubbs and Bailey in 1940, it would have had a range that was basically the headwaters of all the basins from the Black Warrior Basin in Alabama all the way around to the Savannah River Basin in South Carolina and Georgia, with the one exception being the Flint River, which does not have a red-eye bass in it for whatever reason. More recent work has suggested, and I think has formally split them into basically a species for every basin. So we now, in Alabama, we have 4. We have the Black Warrior bass, we have the Cahaba bass, we have the original red-eye bass, which is the type locality is in the Coosa River Basin, and then we have the Tallapoosa bass. And then the next one over east isn't in Alabama, but it's in Georgia. It's the Chattahoochee bass. And then there's 2 more forms that have yet to be described. One is in the Altamaha River Basin in Georgia, proposed to be the Altamaha bass. And the last one is the one that there can't be any arguments about this being a species, because it's the only red-eye bass that can handle impoundment. And that is the Bartram's bass. And that's named after the naturalist William Bartram. But it's down in the Savannah River Basin. Now, these fish are all pretty heavily impearled. They have really small ranges. If you take one fish that's already found in very specific kinds of streams, and then you chop it up by basin, you're starting to look at animals that don't have a large range. Warrior bass, right now, we think might only have a dozen populations that are pure left. Most of them are in Bankhead National Forest. We're not 100% sure what happened to the animal. The Southeast, along with a lot of other places in the country, weren't a happy place in the 40s and 50s and 60s before we had Clean Water Act and stuff like that. So we think there was a lot of mining in that part of Alabama, still is today. The Cahaba bass, the Cahaba River flows right through Birmingham. So needless to say, they have its own issues there. And once you get into Georgia, I mentioned about moving bass. I haven't really pointed fingers at anything yet, but the one that everyone seems to want to move is the Alabama bass. They love fishing for them. They've moved them all through Georgia, and the first thing that they have done when they've gotten into their new home is hybridize with all the natives. And so the Chattahoochee bass is in bad shape between all the urbanization around Atlanta and all the non-natives running around those streams. That's another one where there's probably less than 20 pure populations left, and it's probably less than that, to be honest with you. And the Bartram's bass is the same way. You know, at first they escaped, so the Savannah River is heavily impounded, but they took right to it because for some reason, and no one has figured out why yet, they're the one that can handle impoundment. They're found up in these beautiful mountain streams, but they're also found in the main stem of the Savannah in these large reservoirs. They were so abundant, people would catch them and weigh them in fishing tournaments. You know, they would get like 2.5 pounds in those reservoirs. And then someone threw Alabama bass in there. And currently they're extirpated from all the Savannah River Basin reservoirs. They're extirpated from the Kiowee Reservoir. They're now in the Jocassee, which is at the top of the basin, and you're watching them go away in real time. And of course, the Alabama bass didn't stay in the reservoirs. They're swimming up the streams and hybridizing as they go. And so the Bartram's bass is in pretty precarious straits as well. The one we don't know anything about yet is the Altamaha bass, but their Alabama bass are in all of its habitats too. So the red-eye bass complex, as I think of it, species, subspecies, whatever the heck they really are, I'm not sure. But they are definitely a conservation concern. And honestly, having black bass as a conservation concern is something that had never really been considered until literally about the last 15 years. I think that, well, we still have two more. So we have the Swanee bass. Swanee bass is a really cool animal. It is found in a very small area too. It's a common thing, and they're also only found in rivers. They're found in Gulf Coast rivers, basically from east of the Apalachicola around to the Santa Fe, Guaney systems, like around Gainesville. They like spring-fed rivers. They get about 2.5 to 3 pounds. They don't look like any of the others. They're very dark, real purple on their cheeks, very pretty fish. They're short and fat. They have like a diamond-shaped pattern on them. And that's another one that was described, I'm pretty sure, by Hubbs and Bailey again. It does benefit from the fact that if you take a map out and look at it, with the exception of Tallahassee, that is a rural part of this country. And so it certainly has concerns, agriculture withdrawal, stuff like that. But I mean, I don't think anyone's looked at that and said there's some serious conservation risks right here, other than its small range. You know, if you consider each river its own population, which would be probably a pretty fair assessment, there can't be more than 10. You know, and so even if something horrible happens to one of those rivers, you're lost like 10% of your fish in one swap. So they're one that's probably been studied about the least, because we've just done a lot of recent work on red-eye bass, and Brandon Peoples over in Clemson has done a ton of work on Bartram's bass and still going on. You know, Swanee bass had just some spotty work here and there, so that one's probably been studied the least. And then you have the Guadalupe bass. That's the one that's probably been studied the most. The reason is because it came close to getting extirpated. That's another one where, so first, the Guadalupe bass is native to the Edwards Plateau in Texas. That's what we more commonly or colloquially call the hill country of Texas. It's this beautiful area of land that does not look like you're in central Texas, but you are, to the northwest of San Antonio. Full of spring-fed rivers, rocky, beautiful places. Of course, that's another arid part of the world, so it's always, you know, got wet years and dry years, and their dry years are when their rivers become creeks and their creeks become trickles, kind of a thing. And back in the 70s, I think it was, when this was really common, Texas Parks and Wildlife decided to stock smallmouth bass in a lot of those streams. And the whole idea was to increase fishing opportunities, you know. And back then, that was real common. And nobody had any idea that the fish wouldn't get along. We just was like, oh, you can go catch Guadalupe bass and smallmouth bass. And that's a real common thing. I mean, Tennessee moved red-eye bass up into some streams in the Cumberland Plateau for the same reason. Like, well, yeah, you have smallmouth there, but why don't we have these too, And of course, they hybridized together. And so did the Guadalupe bass and the smallmouth bass. And it was bad, and it was rapid. And that's what you see a lot, is rapid and bad when when fish get moved where they're not supposed to be. And so Texas Parks and Wildlife has literally spent the last 30 years reversing the errors. And I'm happy to say they've been largely successful. And it's the one success story we have of these native black bass. But it came at a huge cost and a huge amount of effort. They developed stocking protocols for pure Guadalupe bass. They tried to remove as many smallmouth bass as they could. A recent drought that dried up some of those lakes, and you saw the pictures in the newspaper of, I remember the one with the fish carcass in the foreground and barren dirt behind it, and they loved that picture. It was all over the newspapers about, oh my gosh, this terrible drought's crushing Central Texas, which is 100% accurate. But what it also did was it dried all those streams up to the point where there were isolated pools, and they just went in there and laid havoc to the smallmouth bass in rivers that otherwise they would have never been able to remove them. What's bad for something turned out to be a benefit for others, and it allowed them to restore fish to a couple streams that I don't think they thought they would be able to do. But today, there's plenty of streams there with pure bass now. There are another Lovic fish. They don't handle reservoirs. They get a couple pounds. They're a pretty little fish. They really are, and they live in beautiful places. And yeah, there's been a lot of work on them, and that tends to happen when something almost gets extirpated. My old advisor here, Mike Messina, used to love to say problems are opportunities. When you have conservation concerns, especially for a fish that's your state fish, which in the case of Guadalupe bass, that's Texas's state fish, it helps you leverage money and attention to solve the problem. That's the one that's nowhere near all the rest of them. It's really interesting if you look at a map of the bass species on a map of the United States, area where I am, like you said, there's all these species right next to each other, overlapping, craziness. And then there's those couple smallmouth bass in western Arkansas and all, and then there's a huge gap all the way over to Texas in the middle of this plateau. Here's this other really cool bass species. So for folks trying to fish and catch all of them, that's the one that always takes the biggest planning, because it's literally a 2-day jaunt to get over there from here anyway, but totally worth it. Totally worth it. So cool over there. It's been so much of a privilege and an exciting opportunity to work on them, because they've changed my concept of bass from what it used to be totally. I had no idea that there could be all these bass that live nowhere but these beautiful streams. When you're red-eye bass fishing, a lot of times you feel like you're in the Appalachians on a trout stream and you're fishing for brook trout, except instead you're fishing for these really, really pretty bass. You also never could believe bass could be that color. I mean, red-eye bass are amazing. I mean, they're blue and they're red and they're orange, and oh yeah, they have some black barring on them too. Yeah, they're just amazing colors on some of these guys. So, they all offer different opportunities, and I definitely use that to my advantage being here. I mean, to me, red-eye bass are my summer fish. You go out with a small light tackle and throw small lures, and you usually can catch a ton of fish. The last time I was out, I think I caught 25 of them in a couple hours. The biggest one was like 8 inches, maybe 10. But still, when they're catching, I mean, they're so pretty that, yeah, you don't take pictures of them, cheesing and grinning like you do with a largemouth. You take them in your hand. They're gorgeous. You look at that, you go, wow, look at the colors on that fish. One of the cool things about them, too, is they're like iridescent almost. And if you take a picture of them under the water, if you have a waterproof camera, they look totally different under the water than they look above the water. It's really amazing, the colors. They're like sunfish in a way, because during the spawning season, their color's even more intense, just like bluegill and redbreast sunfish are, long-eared sunfish. They're ones that really have seasonal color changes, just like panfish. A lot of the others I don't think do that. I don't really ever notice that with shoal bass. Certainly none of the spotted bass or smallmouth bass seem to do that. I can't say I'm that familiar with Guadalupe bass, but I've seen enough pictures of them and I've never seen them really colored up. But the red-eye bass, for sure, they put their best suit on during spawning season, and they still have the colors the rest of the year, but they're toned down a little more.
I've never seen one in person, but I've always wanted to see the turquoise belly of the Swanee bass. When I've seen the photos of those fish, when that turquoise coloration on the abdomen just doesn't look like anything you'd see from a black bass.
And there's big diamond-shaped patterns that they have right running down their sides. Yeah, they're a really cool animal too, and I honestly don't get them down there enough to go after them.
So, are you on a mission to catch all the species?
I don't know that I'll ever do it, because the ones that are going to be the hardest for me will be the Neosho and especially the Washita. That's the only two I haven't caught. I have caught all the others. So maybe one of these days I'll get over there and trudge around. Like I said, the Neosho is not actually that difficult. You just have to be in the right area at the right time. The Washita ones, you have to find someone who knows where they are and can drop you a pin. So you can go find them, because a lot of what's there is probably hybrids. I don't know if I could ever pull that off, but I would certainly like to go to the Ozarks and catch some Neoshos, because I've seen a lot of pictures, with Shannon's work, and that's another beautiful area of the world, man. There's something different about catching whatever it is, whether it's a shoal bass or a red-eye bass or a Swanee bass or a Neosho bass or even Guadalupe bass, all of which occur in clear spring-fed streams. I mean, just something about fishing for bass in a stream where you can see bottom in 10 feet of water, like the water's not even there. It's so clear. That's a different experience than certainly what I grew up doing. You don't think of that as much as bass fishing. It really is a lot more like trout fishing.
I don't know. You've made me want to come over and fish for shoal bass during the springs.
Oh my gosh, that's an experience. I mean, how many times can you catch a 6-pound bass in 3.5 feet of water, and then they're right out in the current? And one of my students that was from the western part of the country, she didn't get to work on shoal bass, but she fished for him with me, and she confirmed what I always thought in my head without me prompting her. After a day of doing that, she's like, "This is like salmon fishing." And I'm like, I always thought that, but I've never salmon fished, so I didn't feel like that was something I could say, But they're in faster water than most trout are. Like they get behind a boulder right in the middle of the current, and I mean, some of us call them the grouper of the rivers, because they love to hide in these little holes and dart out and grab it, and then they try to get right back in there. I mean, you cannot fish those things with 6-pound test. I'm out there with 30-pound braid and a 20-pound fluorocarbon leader, because they're going to take you into the rocks. It's just a question, are they going to saw you off or not? Because you're not going to stop them.
So there you have it. I think we've covered all 14 confirmed species and touched on the 5 or 6 potential new species. So, if you're interested in catching all the black bass species, you now know more about them and some idea of where to go find them. Steve, thank you so much for coming today. I've enjoyed talking with you. I hope you had a good time too.
Oh man, thank you for the opportunity. I always enjoy talking about these fish. They're really special, and people who want to go after them, they will be rewarded just with the scenery alone, let alone the animal themselves.
And thanks everyone for joining Fish University. I hope we'll see you again next time. Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.